Good morning. And thank you for being here. And we've reached the conclusion. All this semester, twice a week, we have considered one of Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge's hero tales of American history. We've been through a great many adventures along the way. Daniel Boone and the founding of Kentucky, Kings Mountain, the burning of the Philadelphia, Governor Morris, the charge at Gettysburg, Sheridan at Cedar Creek, the death of Stonewall Jackson. In each case of the many tales that we've been through, Roosevelt and Lodge are authors and great American statesmen in their own right, and Theodore Roosevelt, a great American military hero in his own right. They have talked about practical lessons, about strategy, about leadership, about character. And those things have come through every story. And one of the things that's interesting to me about this, I mentioned that Teddy Roosevelt was a great American military hero as a member and then as the commander of the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War. That was later. That was after he had written this book. So in a way, you could say that Teddy Roosevelt lived out what he wanted to teach others through the book Hero Tales. He lived out the virtues, the character traits, and also some of the practical lessons about how to do things in a conflict that come through Hero Tales. When we began with George Washington. Today's final chapter is about Abraham Lincoln, the other best known American president. And I was surprised. Sometimes you learn more when you teach something than when you learned it yourself. And this time through the book, I was a little surprised how short Lincoln's essay is compared to Farragut at Mobile Bay. And that's what we did last session, was the great admiral, great Union admiral at a great naval battle. And I think that's what Roosevelt was really building up to, the lessons of Farragut at Mobile Bay. And that Lincoln is almost a little tag on at the end. In fact, most of this essay on Lincoln is actually Lincoln's own words. Two of his most famous addresses are in here in full. One of them is his Gettysburg Address. One of them is the second inaugural address. And Roosevelt and Lodge don't write a lot about Abe Lincoln himself. But what they do write, well, we're going to look at it in context of the first essay in the book. Here you see our authors that we've spent such pleasant sessions with, who kicked off their book with the father of our country, George Washington, our first president, and a terrific general and a gifted leader of men. I thought for this last session, we'd look back to the beginning of our volume and remind ourselves what lessons we were to draw from the very beginning. When they kicked off these lessons, what were the things they emphasized about George Washington? They called him the son of Virginia and father of the USA. As a son of Virginia, as a man of America. He was a guy who lived a strenuous life. Teddy Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge were people who wanted you to go out and find challenges to become strong. And they emphasized how the frontier made men strong. Washington's vigor, that he was a physically and mentally strong man who faced and overcame challenges, that he lived a lot of time in the woods as a surveyor, that he knew the wilderness well. It's where he fought his first campaigns. His farsightedness, that George Washington was able to look ahead, and that this farsightedness was matched with he was willing to take and use power for the common good. But George Washington did not relish power. He didn't want to hold power forever. He turned down kingship when he could have grasped it. That he was a very serious and dignified man, a man of gravity, a character for ages to admire. Now let's think about Abraham Lincoln and how much these things applied to him. Are they closing the book in a very similar way to the way they opened it? I think they are. Lincoln's vigor, he too is a man of the frontier, Abe the log splitter. He's worked hard. Farsightedness. In this little essay about Lincoln, they emphasize, hey, well, he was able to look ahead and make decisions gradually. His attitude towards power, that it should be used shrewdly and carefully and for the public good, is something that Roosevelt and Lodge very much as Republicans who are not too far from the founding of the party with Lincoln. He is their model, and they look at Lincoln and that's what they see is power used shrewdly and wisely in order to move the country forward. Gravity, a character for the ages to admire. But they see some things too that are very different about young Lincoln and young Washington. Washington, remember, they said came from a distinguished family that had given him all that good birth and tradition could give. And several times in their book, they've talked about somebody coming from a good family who got all of the benefits of a good family. That everything that good birth and tradition, sometimes everything that wealth and education could give, men that would, today the term would be privilege, men of privilege who used the good things that they had inherited and been blessed with for the public good. Maybe even, gave up their lives in the necessary circumstances. We saw that with Shaw. Okay, now Lincoln. Lincoln does not come from that direction at all. And they have also emphasized in this book men who come from very different backgrounds. Not all their characters come from a distinguished family. Some do not. And wow, the things they write about Lincoln's family here. Quoting, "No great man ever came from beginnings that seemed to promise so little. Lincoln's family, for more than one generation, had been sinking instead of rising in the social scale. His father was one of those men who were found on the frontier in the early days of the Western movement, always changing from one place to another and dropping a little lower at each remove. Abraham Lincoln was born into a family who was not only poor, but also shiftless. And his early days were days of ignorance and poverty and hard work. Out of such inauspicious surroundings, he slowly and painfully lifted himself. He gave himself an education. He took part in an Indian war. He worked in the fields. He kept a country store. He read and studied. And at last, he became a lawyer then. he entered into the rough politics of the newly settled state. So, what do they have to say about Lincoln's leadership? Thinking of Washington at the same time. He slowly and painfully lifted himself from a family of low origins. And Lodge and Roosevelt don't go into details about every bad decision, but as Daniel Boone, moving from place to place in the frontier, had elevated himself with each move. Everything got a little better each time. That phrase about Lincoln's father, that always changing from one place to another and dropping a little lower at each remove. So his origins are very humble. His family background is not great. He is praised for his power and brilliancy in debate, something Lodge and Roosevelt appreciate and admire. He really becomes a champion for abolition, for the anti-slavery cause against Stephen Douglas in a series of debates, and loses as a Senate candidate. He loses against Douglas, but in the debates, he has been a very eloquent voice for anti-slavery. And in this way, a lot of the people that we have studied in this book have not been known for debating. A very few have, but one who was John Quincy Adams. Remember the chapter, John Quincy Adams and the right of petition. Roosevelt emphasizes that Lincoln was fighting the anti-slavery battle within constitutional lines, that he was trying to forward the cause of abolition by reason and within what the Constitution allowed the government to do, not to go outside of that, as opposed to, say, John Brown, who was advocating violent slave revolt. Abraham Lincoln is trying to work within the system. He does go to Congress, returns from Congress, and winds up being the Republican presidential candidate. And at this point, the real test is going to happen. When Lincoln wins the election, that cues secession and the beginning of the great conflict. Quoting, "No public man, no great popular leader ever faced a more terrible situation. The Union was breaking, the Southern states were seceding, treason was rampant in Washington, and the government was bankrupt. The country knew Lincoln was a man of great capacity in debate, devoted to the cause of anti-slavery and the maintenance of the Union, but what his ability was to deal with the awful conditions by which he was surrounded, no one knew." So this is Lincoln's great test, as in many ways it is the Union's great test. To follow him through the 4 years of civil war which ensued is, of course, impossible here. They don't try to tell the big story. They pull out one point, though. Lincoln put to the front the question of the Union and let the question of slavery drop at first into the background. During the first more than a year of the war, the Union does not take a firm policy about slavery. Certainly, Lincoln doesn't say, "We're going to war in order to free the slaves." Lincoln emphasizes, "We're going to war to save the Union." And Roosevelt and Lodge say that his pushing that question of slavery down the road, I'm sure they're aware, they don't quote in their essay, but I'm sure they're aware of his famous letter in which Lincoln wrote that if he could save the Union by freeing the slaves, he would. If he could save the Union by keeping them in slavery, he would. And if he could save the Union by freeing some and leaving others in slavery, he would do that too. That the Union was his priority. They're aware of that, and they praise it as wise statesmanship. He used every exertion to hold the border states by moderate measures, and in this way prevented the spread of rebellion. For this moderation, the anti-slavery extremists in the North assailed him, but nothing shows more his far-sighted wisdom and strength of purpose than his action at this time. By his policy at the beginning of his administration, he held the border states and united the people of the North in defense of the Union. Defending the Union was a uniting theme, whereas struggling against slavery was a divisive theme within the Union. And so Lincoln and Lodge are praising their political hero. And again, these are late 19th century Republicans, only 30 years, less than 30 years after the end of the war. And they are praising the founder of their party for his political wisdom. Perhaps Lincoln's nickname, Shrewd Abe, would have been a very good one. His leadership qualities, clear to all men. The qualities that enabled him to do this great work are very clear now to all men. His courage and his wisdom, his keen perception, and his almost prophetic foresight enabled him to deal with all the problems of that distracted time as they arose around him. But he had some qualities, apart from those of the intellect, of equal importance. His character, at once strong and gentle, gave confidence to everyone and dignity to his cause. He had an infinite patience and a humor that enabled him to turn aside many difficulties which could have been met in no other way. But most important of all, Roosevelt writes, was the fact that he personified a great sentiment which ennobled and uplifted his people and made them capable of the patriotism which fought the war and saved the Union. He embodied in his own person all their highest ideals, and he never erred in his judgment. Lincoln's struggles as commander-in-chief are well known and worth reading about. Here's a original photo of Lincoln with Union Army officers sort of towering over them. He would be towering over them even without the tall hat, but of course the tall hat adds to the effect a little bit. This is specifically after the Battle of Sharpsburg or Antietam. And Lincoln as a leader of the people is how Roosevelt and Lodge remember him most, and as a man who came to stand for the idea of getting rid of slavery. And that ideal, both of the Union, the great nation that Theodore Roosevelt is going to wind up leading as president, and that Henry Cabot Lodge is also an important director of the direction of that great nation, but also as one who put the horror of slavery into the past. So they end their essay. They give really half of the space of their Roosevelt essay, or their Lincoln essay, to the full text of two of his most famous speeches, one of which is very short, the Gettysburg Address. The other one is his second inaugural address, which Lincoln, the war was ending. Lincoln did not know it. He did not have very long left until the assassin, John Wilkes Booth, would creep up on him and shoot him in a theater. As they put it, a miserable assassin crept into the box of the theater and shot him. So it would be his last big public statement about his values and where he wanted, how he wanted the nation to see the war as a struggle which had ended and should end without bitterness, that the end of slavery had been accomplished by the end of the war as well, and that a bright future, but also a heavy responsibility was before all Americans. And that second inaugural address uses a lot of religious language. It's a very spiritually minded address. Speaking of the two sides of the war, Lincoln said, each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. Skipping. The Almighty has his own purposes. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Well, that famous paragraph characterizes the book, Hero Tales, and it also characterizes, I think, what Teddy Roosevelt would try to do with his own presidency. Malice toward none and charity toward all. You notice that in this book, not just in the chapters about the North and South, but even when Americans are fighting Mexicans or the British, there is always a word of respect for the enemy and looking at the people who are being struggled against with dignity and without malice, without hatred. Maybe they need to be defeated. Yes, maybe we're even angry at them at the time, but it's not malice. It's not the long-standing, bitter, irrational hatred that can characterize nations. Malice toward none. And we're going to see that. We saw that in the book, in the descriptions, and we see it in Roosevelt's presidency. With firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. And people who were firm in the purpose of doing the right thing have been featured in this book, whether it's Parkman writing history books, whether it is John Quincy Adams arguing in the Senate, whether it is Governor Morris risking his own one-legged life, saving refugees from the French Revolution. Firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive to finish the work we're in, to bind up the nation's wounds. And this book was meant to help bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and his widow and his orphan. Teddy Roosevelt is going to make a point about the black soldiers who fight beside him in the Spanish-American War. When he comes home, he says, a man who is good enough to fight for his nation is good enough to be given a square deal afterwards. And he's going to work during his presidency to make sure Americans get a square economic deal, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And when Theodore Roosevelt, the famous war hero, becomes president, there's a wonderful story about a reporter asking him, you know, you're known as such a war hero, and yet we have not had any wars during your presidency. Why is that? And Theodore, I'm paraphrasing from memory here, but Theodore Roosevelt told the reporter, what kind of man do you think I am? I would never start a war that I couldn't fight in personally. And that sort of balance between eagerness for adventure and to stand firm for the right eagerness for adventure and conflict and to stand firm for the right, but also valuing peace and valuing that you don't waste anybody's life in unnecessary conflicts. Those two things kind of weave together in Roosevelt's life and presidency too. So I think that in the end of these 24 hero tales, we've gone from Washington to Lincoln. All of these are going to be available on as recorded sessions through the museum's website and on YouTube. And we're going to come up with a little lesson plan to go with them as well for people who want to go through this book in the future. Thank you for joining me and Teddy and Henry Cabot Lodge in considering these American heroes. I hope you've enjoyed it. And Teddy Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge and I all hope that you find inspiring lessons and maybe some things that'll influence decisions that you make as you face your own challenges. Thank you all very much.